Okay, is that better? So there's this little verse in Proverbs. Proverbs is, well, you might not think the same as me, but Proverbs, I think, is a strange book because you find a really fascinating little nugget, and then it's probably one or two lines, and then it's off somewhere else, and you think, oh, well, was that it? But anyway, Proverbs chapter 13, verse 12 says, hope deferred makes the heart sick, but a longing fulfilled is a tree of life. Hope deferred. The Bible encourages us to hope, and not looking at them today because of time, but in 1 Corinthians there's those verses that I bet you all know where it says, and these three things remain, and one of them is hope. We are always encouraged in the Bible to hope. So what does this verse mean? Well, in the commentaries it puts it really in a nutshell, because it says that hope realised equals joy and happiness. And it says that the tree of life metaphor, which has other meanings to do with eternity and all sorts of things, but in this instance it changes and it represents happiness. So that's why a longing fulfilled is happiness. But hope unrealised equals disappointment or discouragement. Now, the neuroscience behind disappointment is really interesting, because when you feel disappointed in your brain, and you can't do anything about this, it's how we were made. So it's going to happen. Doesn't matter what strung upper lip or what sort of person you are. When you are disappointed, two transmitters fire at the same time, and that's a rare event. It only happens about 3-ish times. And when those transmitters fire, chemicals are released. Now, how much chemical is released doesn't depend on how big the actual event was. It depends on how disappointed you personally are. Now, that's a big difference, because I have a testimony about that, actually, because there was a time when Robin wasn't paid. And there were several times where Robin wasn't paid, and one of the things I wanted to do was the garden. And I painstakingly dug out this massive trees, and apart from three of the very biggest trees, which Robin had to do, but I dug them all out, and I'd have to wait a few weeks for a root to rot a bit more, and then I'd probably dig out, and I'd have a big piece like this, and I'd come in and show him, and I'd cleared this garden, but then he wasn't getting paid, so we couldn't do the garden. And what happened was, we unexpectedly got a large sum of money, and were quite blessed but puzzled. And Robin said, you can do the garden. And within a week we discovered that we had been defrauded, and it was to the amount of money that God had already provided. And I could not see the blessing. I was so disappointed that everybody else was saying, God's amazing, he provided that money that you were defrauded of before you needed it. And all I could see was that I didn't have my garden. And I was so upset, I had to take it to my supervisor and work it out. And yet, We'll go again. So it's not about, you see, that was a miracle. God sorted a thing before we even knew we needed it sorted. So it's not about how big the event is. It's about how big the disappointment you feel is. And that is affected by where you are at the moment, by your previous life experience, by even things like your physical health at the time. So the amount of chemicals that are released into your system are dependent on how big how much disappointment you feel. So little disappointments can tip you over the edge, can be one too many. And those chemicals, once they're in your system, they act like a dimmer switch. So you won't just feel down about disappointment, everything gets dampened. Your joy is robbed, not just in the thing that you were disappointed about, but in everything. It's like it's a bit like this microphone is doing today, just cuts out everything. And all of the chemicals that are usually in your brain that relate to pleasure and motivation are reduced. So even if something good comes along in that moment, you'll only enjoy it this much instead of that much, because those chemicals to enjoy that are reduced. It's linked to depression, and it affects your behaviours because it affects your moral judgment. So while those chemicals are swirling in your brain, you could do something that you would never have done before. You could sin. You could treat somebody harshly. You could behave in a way that is out of character. When I learnt that, one of the things I was challenged about was, I hope that I learn never to react to someone else's disappointment with a throwaway, like, well, it wasn't very much that happened, or you'll go over it, it could have been worse. Because now I understand that that's all going on in our brains, and it's all beyond our control. So do we have anybody in the Bible who reacted in any of those ways? And the first one I think of is Jonah. So in Jonah chapter 4, verses 1 to 5, we have, "But to Jonah this seemed very wrong, and he became very angry. He prayed to the Lord, 'Isn't this what I said, Lord, when I was still at home? This is what I tried to forestall by fleeing to Tarshish. I knew that you are a gracious and compassionate God, slow to anger and abounding in love, a God who relents from sending calamity. Now, Lord, take my life away, for it is better for me to die than to live.' But the Lord replied, 'Is it right for you to be so angry?' Jonah had gone out and sat down at a place east of the city. There he made himself a shelter, sat in its shade, and waited to see what would happen to the city." You see, Jonah's a little bit in the place I was in, isn't he? That he's got, God's done something mighty. God's bringing about revival. But Jonah's disappointed. He didn't want it to be this way. He's disappointed in God and in God's reaction. He says, "I knew you'd do this. I knew you'd have grace." It's not what he wanted God to do. And his response to that disappointment is that he wants to die. He wants to give up, and he's angry. So he goes and sits under the tree. That's his way of giving up. And we will probably find it quite hard to admit to one another that at times God is the one who has disappointed us. and that what he has or hasn't done is the root cause of the disappointment we hold. We would find that hard to admit. And we don't know the answer to that because God's purposes and plans are throughout eternity. We don't get the answers yet, but it does happen, and it's still disappointment. And then there's disappointment in relationships. So in Acts chapter 15, verses 36 to 40, we have, sometime later, Paul said to Barnabas, "Let us go back and visit the believers in all the towns where we preach the word of the Lord and see how they are doing." Barnabas wanted to take John, also called Mark, with them, but Paul did not think it wise to take him because he had deserted them in Pamphylia and had not continued with them in the work. They had such a sharp disagreement that they parted company. Barnabas took Mark and sailed for Cyprus, but Paul chose Silas and left, commanded by the believers to the grace of the Lord. There's disappointment here because Paul is disappointed in the way that John Mark behaved and that he left them. So Paul's behaviours are affected because he won't give him a second chance. He's not giving him a second chance. So disappointment in one another can affect our relationships. And sometimes it can be really hard to give someone that you're disappointed in a second chance, or see them in a different light because of all the stuff that happened in your brain when you were disappointed. When you see them, you probably remember. In this story, God works it all out. And he can work it out in our stories and our relationships if we allow him. But sometimes, when you're disappointed in a person, you have to sort of ask yourself if it's an actual or a disappointment or a perceived disappointment. Because we can hold people to things that it's not right to hold them to. Now, I know a lady when she was brought up, their parents labelled them. There were 3 of them. One was the clever one was the pretty one, and one was the musical one. And they grew up knowing that. And the clever one I'll try to explain. Whenever she dresses up or has her hair done, always feels disappointed because she wears the label that she was the clever one, not the pretty one. So you see, some disappointments are perceived, and we need to pray about that. If we've got something in our relationships and it's based on disappointment, it may well be that we put unfair burdens and expectations on that person. Or maybe somebody did that to you, and that's far more about them than about you, but you've experienced their disappointment. And then there's Peter. There's lots of things he could pull out about Peter, but I just have one as an example. So I'm in Matthew 26, verses 69 to 75. Now Peter was sitting out in the courtyard, and a servant girl came to him. "You also were with Jesus of Galilee," she said. But he denied it before them all. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said. Then he went out to the gateway where another servant girl saw him and said to the people there, "This fellow was with Jesus of Nazareth." He denied it again with an oath, "I don't know the man." After a little while, those standing there went up to Peter and said, "Surely you are one of them. Your accent gives you away." Then he began to call down curses and he swore to them, "I don't know the man." Immediately a rooster crowed. Then Peter remembered the word Jesus had spoken, "Before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times." And he went outside and wept bitterly. And I think we can quite reasonably assume that Peter had a huge disappointment in himself at that point, because he had said to Jesus, "I won't fail you." And Jesus had told him, "Well, you will. You're going to deny me 3 times. "No, I won't." And you can see there as well the behaviours kicking in. So Peter would have been experiencing huge disappointment in himself. And what do we do when we're disappointed in ourselves? Most of us, many times, will beat ourselves up internally. We give ourselves a self-beating. But the answer to this, and I'm not going to read I'm not going to read all of this because of time. But you see, the thing with Peter is he's got huge resilience. You see, in John chapter 20, verses 1 to 6, when they hear that the tomb is empty, Peter is back. It says, "Early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb and saw the stone had been removed from the entrance. So she came running to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one Jesus loved, and said, 'They've taken the Lord out of the tomb and we don't know where they have put him.' So Peter and the other disciple started for the tomb. Both were running, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. He bent over and looked in at the strips of linen lying there, but did not go in. Then Simon Peter came along behind him and went straight into the tomb." See, there's resilience. That's that ability to bounce back. So the chemical reaction and all the feelings happened, but Peter is back. And the other disciple got there first, but didn't go in, just peered. But Peter, the Peter we know, he was right in there. And we all differ in resilience. And we can't really sort of talk about resilience in the same sermon because of time, but we all differ in resilience. And there's different reasons for that. But if we looked at the very next chapter, we would see Jesus takes Peter aside. And there's that time where he sits with him and says, "Do you love me?" And he asks him 3 times, "Do you really love me?" And I think one of the things that is happening here is that after Peter had failed and disappointed Jesus and himself so abysmally, Jesus is taking time out to restore him. And this is what he needed, because Peter will go on to be Peter, the rock on which Jesus builds his church. And so that brings us back to the verses we had earlier. Isaiah 61, 1-3. The Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is on me, because the Lord has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives and release from darkness for the prisoners, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favour and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn and provide for those who grieve in Zion, to bestow on them a crown of beauty instead of ashes, the oil of joy instead of mourning, and a garment of praise instead of a spirit of despair. They will be called oaks of righteousness, a planting of the Lord, for the display of his splendour. I know we have it because when you're disappointed about something, it's a type of grief, it's a type of mourning, and your joy is lost. And it's all in those verses because Jesus came to heal us and restore us and make us whole again. And it's not a once for all thing, because we live here and we walk through life, we get damaged again and things happen, new things happen. And so it's a constant that we need to keep going back and getting healed and restored. In the same way that Jesus restored Peter, and we've got the story of that, sometimes it's just a quiet time between you and him. Sometimes it's somebody praying with you. Sometimes you need to talk it out and you need to go through it. But there is healing for those things. I shared this with someone that I've only recently been getting to know, and I knew that she'd had a hard time. I knew one thing, and when we talked, she gave me the list, and by the end of it, I thought, I don't know how this person is standing and carrying on. And she said to me, I didn't know what was wrong with me until you explained. And she said, now I'm talking through the list with the Lord. And as I talk it through with him, something is changing. And whatever disappointments you've been through, and whether you've buried them for a long time or whether they're current, Jesus comes to restore and heal you today. To bind up the brokenhearted, to free the captives, to release from darkness the prisoners, to comfort all who mourn and grieve, to bestow a crown of beauty instead of the ashes, the oil of joy instead of mourning, and a garment of praise instead of a spirit of despair. So if that's you this morning, don't go home without talking to someone you trust, or asking for prayer, or talking to God yourself about it, and receiving that restoration and that healing that he told us he came to bring.